Let's read this text together. It's from Mark chapter 1, and let's see what the actual text is. Well, y'all can find it. I think it starts in verse 26 or 29, something like that. But I don't have the text listed on here. But Mark chapter 1, you can find it. Let's begin. So they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they all asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, he took her hand, and he helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." And so he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So I love this story, and there's so much here that we can unpack, and we're going to unpack a good bit of it this morning, but we're not going to be able to get into every single detail, obviously, and so come join us tomorrow if you got other things that you want to get into, or if you just want to talk more about the message. But today, what I want to talk to you, I want to focus in on this, all right? I want to talk to you about engagement and withdrawal. Engagement and withdrawal. This is a pattern of Jesus' life that Mark focuses on in his gospel. It's all throughout the gospel. Engagement and withdrawal. Jesus was highly engaged with the world around him. Last week we talked about three things, right? He formed community through calling men and women to be disciples. So he formed this intimate community around him by calling disciples. We talked about how he spent time with the crowds, right? The crowds was this teeming mass of the poor and the sick and the oppressed that came to Jesus for help, and he loved them and he spent time with them. And we talked about Jesus' conflict with the authorities who were hurting others. Jesus was highly engaged with the world around him. He wasn't hiding out in safe spaces all the time, but he was deeply and highly engaged with the world around him. Y'all saw that in the story that we read. Yet he was also did something else. He went to great lengths to withdraw to safer spaces where he could unwind and relax and be refreshed. He did not allow the world around him to cave in on him and completely consume him. He was so intentional about retreating away, about withdrawing to safe spaces for restoration and renewal. We see this rhythm in Jesus' life, and when you read Mark, you will see it. There's engagement, intense, highly engaged, and withdrawal. Engagement and withdrawal. We're going to get into this for this message this morning. For me, let me just give you a personal example, if this can help you think through this a bit. For me, the first month of this year, in 2021, has been full of engagement. So much is happening. I've had so many deep and profound and challenging conversations with people in our church, with leaders in our church, about what our witness ought to be during this crazy time in our community and our nation. Laura and I have opened up our home for foster care, and that anticipation and now the waiting has been both exciting and terrifying. So many people that I know and that you all know are in pain and are suffering and are struggling. And I felt at times, even just in the past month, that the world around me is pressing in on me with great force. Do y'all feel like that sometimes? It's just pressing in on us, and it can feel very overwhelming. On Wednesday morning this week, I was feeling the weight, and I took some time to be very intentional, to take some silence and solitude. I went up into our new nursery that we've put together in our home that's still waiting on a child, and I sat in this kind of glider chair we have up there, and I just breathed. And I asked God to meet me, and it took some time, but I felt God's presence. And I was reminded in that moment that I need to be fighting for these moments more often. I need to be very intentional and seek these moments out, because they don't just come naturally, right? I need Jesus' rhythm of engagement and withdrawal. Do y'all feel me? Are y'all resonating with this? The text that we're looking at this morning is what you could call a day in the life of Jesus. All right, a day in the life of Jesus. What Mark does in these verses is he lays out, this is kind of a skill that Mark has. He's laying this out as a 24-hour time span on Jesus' first public day in ministry, according to Mark. 24 hours in the life of Jesus. This day begins on the morning of the Sabbath, which for Christians, they started practicing Sabbath on Sunday because of the resurrection. But for Jews, the Sabbath was on Saturday, and so it begins the morning of the Sabbath. And this 24-hour time period ends the morning of the following day. Now keep in mind this pattern, this theme of engagement and withdrawal as we break this passage down, all right? So let's jump into it. So Jesus and his first disciples that he had called, they left this kind of rural country area out in the countryside near the Sea of Galilee and headed into the city. I've been to the Sea of Galilee. I've been to places where they believe maybe Jesus called these first disciples. Beautiful, peaceful place. So they left this beautiful, peaceful, quiet, kind of rural area and headed into the city. As we read Mark, one thing we need to do is we need to pay attention to location, all right? We need to pay attention to location. Don't just pay attention to what happens in Mark, but pay close attention to where things happen also. This move from the rural kind of country area to the city is important in the Gospel of Mark. Location is so important to Mark. The rural areas in Galilee were densely populated by many poor people. Many of these folks were day laborers, who a day laborer has to work every day. They show up not knowing if they're going to make enough money for that day, but they tried their best each day just to earn enough to survive. When I lived in Cambodia for 6 months, there were so many, the majority of the Cambodians there in the city, they just showed up to every day, tried to make ends meet, did what they could to sell things, to make money, to survive. Ryan and Amanda in Honduras have told me about neighbors and folks who show up and they'll sell like sticks of gum and things like that to try to make money enough to eat every single day just to survive. They're not saving, they're trying to survive. So that's what kind of the rural countryside area was like in Galilee for most people. Now, the cities were where the wealthier folks probably lived. There was more opportunity to get ahead in the city. There was more power, more prestige in the city. And what we're going to find in Mark, and you'll notice this as you read through it, is that Mark, the rural kind of wilderness countryside places are often portrayed in a more positive light in Mark. And the cities and the temple and the synagogue, which are the places of prestige and power, are portrayed actually in a more negative light. And isn't this kind of an upside down way that they would look at things? Like the people there in that time would have said, no, the places of power and prestige, that's what needs the positive attention. But Jesus kind of flips it on his head. And Mark highlights this in his gospel. And so we need to pay attention to this as we're going through it. So remember, when Jesus goes into the cities, these religious and political places of power, he's usually not well received. He faces conflict and opposition. Right off the bat, on the Sabbath, he goes into the city of Capernaum and entered into the synagogue. Now, the synagogue was a very sacred space. It's kind of like our churches. You know, they had the temple in Jerusalem, which is like the most sacred space, but there's only one temple. And so they had these synagogues all throughout the area in the different places, kind of the hubs in the different communities where they would go, hear the Torah read, they would worship, do sacrifices, those kinds of things. And so the synagogue is a very sacred space, and it was on the Sabbath, which is the most sacred time. And so immediately in the most sacred space, on the most sacred day of Sabbath, Jesus faced intense opposition. On Jesus' first day of public ministry, he faced opposition in the religious space. Mark is letting us know right off the bat that Jesus is going to have conflict with the authorities. And when I say authorities, it's not just religious authority, okay? Because they didn't have a separation of church and state like we do in America now. The religious authority were also political authority as well. They govern the people. They enforce laws. And so Jesus was having conflict with this kind of religious political authority. And we see right off the bat that this is going to be a theme in his ministry. And so Jesus went into the synagogue and he encountered a demonic spirit that seemed to be speaking on behalf of the scribal authorities that were in charge of these political religious institutions in Capernaum. And the spirit was afraid, and the spirit asked Jesus, he said, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" He says, "Have you come to destroy us?" He says, "What do you want with us? Have you come to destroy us?" And when the demonic spirit says us, people have wondered, who is he referring to? Who is this spirit referring to? Well, it seems to be that what is happening here is Jesus has invaded a space into the synagogue where the scribal authorities were in charge, and it seems to be that the Spirit is speaking on behalf of the scribal authorities because Jesus is entering into their domain. Something about Jesus' teachings and his presence in that space was threatening to the people in power. Now, isn't it interesting that the religious space was not a welcoming place for Jesus or his message? Makes me wonder today if our churches, really, I think many churches are not welcoming spaces of the true Jesus and his message and his teaching. You got to understand something about the gospel is good news to some, but the gospel is terrifying to others. And we're going to see this throughout the gospel of Mark. So Jesus exorcised the demon from the man, and his popularity immediately rose. People saw, they're like, man, his teaching was off the hook. That dude was teaching with authority, and they're like, he just said that demon, he just kicked him out, right? I mean, this guy's got power. And so his popularity started to rise quickly. They were amazed. And so Jesus left the synagogue. They were probably wanting him to stay longer, but he left and he withdrew to the home of Simon and Andrew. He was likely hoping, I think, to withdraw to a more welcoming space in the home of his new friends, which it probably was that. He had engaged in direct conflict with the powerful religious authorities. They were already angry at him, and perhaps he needed a breather, right? However, when he arrived at the home, he probably thought he was going to unwind in their house, but then Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a fever. She was struggling. And so Jesus, he stayed engaged, stayed locked in, stayed present to that moment, and he did something quite radical for her in that home. He healed her, and this was a very radical move. Let me give you 2 reasons why this healing was pretty radical. First off, he touched Simon's mother-in-law, and he wasn't related to her. This would have been very scandalous for a Jewish teacher to take her hand in that way and lift her up. Boundary breaking, right? We talked about that a few weeks ago. Jesus, he didn't play by the rules that everybody else played with. So he touched her, lifted her up. Secondly, he healed her. Now, 2 things about the healing. First off, Jesus' first healing in Mark is the healing of a woman. Women during that time, worse off, even worse than today. There's still issues today with this, but women were not valued like they should have been. Patriarchy was strong and alive and well. And this act of Jesus healing a woman, and that being the first healing, would have been boundary breaking and shocking. But even for Mark's readers, like a few decades later when they read this, they would have been blown away by this move of Jesus. So it would have been boundary breaking and shocking. And also, the second thing is he healed her on the Sabbath. Now, healing on the Sabbath was a violation of the law. This was not just breaking some religious rule. No, this was a violation of the law. Can be prosecuted for these things. Now, this healing was done in private in a home, and so he didn't get caught this time. But Mark is alerting the reader right off the bat that Jesus isn't going to play by the same rules as everyone else, and that the Sabbath is going to be an issue because he's going to take this public at some point and violate that rule in public. But for now, he's breaking that rule in the privacy of a home. We're going to talk about this more later on in this series, but these healings, we're going to talk more about healing, but healing in Mark, it's not so much about this demonstration of supernatural power. That's part of it, right? That's part of it. But here's the thing. There were magicians, there were healers all over the ancient world. The authorities would not have been angry with Jesus that he claimed to have this healing power, because that was very common. But you got to ask the question, why did the authorities get so mad at Jesus when he was healing people? Well, they get angry at Jesus because Jesus' healings always broke boundaries and disrupted the social hierarchies that were being enforced through the purity laws. This is very important. The healings were not just about God's supernatural power. That's part of it. But there's something deeper. It's this boundary-breaking act where Jesus is abolishing these walls that we set up and these hierarchies that society had set up through these purity laws. So we'll talk about that more in the future, but back to the story. So perhaps after the healing of the mother-in-law, Jesus is tired, like the kids were noticing, right? He's tired. He's probably wanting to rest. So they probably hung out, maybe ate some food. And then at sunset, things started to get even more crazy. As soon as the Sabbath was over, because now it's legal to heal, right? Because the sundown, Sabbath is over, hordes of poor and sick people showed up to the door of that home wanting a healing experience from Jesus. Now, these people probably faced all sorts of illnesses and other ailments that kept them separate from others. And Jesus healed them, and he made them whole. He treated them not as social outcasts, but as people of dignity, of value, of worth. The ill in that time were often poor, and they were not permitted to have access to the things that led to flourishing for so many others in that society. And as we know, even today, the poor often face illness, right? The poor often face illness, and illness often makes people poor. So when Jesus healed them, he tore down the walls and hierarchies of his day, which really upset the authorities. And it's interesting to me that the religious authorities were so concerned all the time about being contaminated by the poor and the sick, when the reality was that they were the ones doing the contaminating by enforcing a way of life that led to immense suffering for so many. Jesus' witness and his love for those on the margins exposed the sin of those in power, and for that reason, Jesus was a threat to them. They didn't want him exposing their sin, nor do we like when people expose ours, do we? So after a full day of engagement with the complex and difficult world around him, a full day of breaking boundaries, of loving the sick and outcast, of teaching about the upside-down kingdom, Jesus went to sleep, utterly exhausted, I'm sure. Have you ever been exhausted after a full day of engaging with the world around you? I am always exhausted if I've been engaged for a full day. As an introvert, man, that energy just leaves me, and I've just exhausted sometimes at the end of the day. So the next morning, maybe I'm sure Jesus slept well that night, and he got up before everybody else, even so, being so tired. He got up before everyone else, and what did he do? He withdrew. He pulled away. He left the house, and he retreated even further to a solitary place to regain perspective, to refocus, to reconnect with his inner self and with the Father in heaven. This wasn't just like turning on Netflix or numbing with a podcast or indulging in overeating or drinking. It wasn't running away from his obligations or abandoning the mission. No, it was intentional, deep, spiritual time away with himself and with God, so that he could be true to himself and stay true to the mission that he was given. It's engagement and withdrawal. They go together. And so he's withdrew to a solitary place. His disciples wake up after him, and they immediately notice Jesus was gone. And so they man, where's he at? And so they go to find him. Immediately, they go find him. I mean, we can see why Jesus had to be so intentional about getting up early and getting away from the house, right? Because the demands around him were so strong, even his friends didn't want him to go away. They wanted him to be right there. We're not Jesus, but we do know about the demands of the world around us being strong. One thing that's striking to me is Jesus' intentionality. It's like he put it on his calendar before he went to bed. Time away, 4:30 a.m., whenever it was, right? Time away. And so they found him and they exclaimed, they said, Jesus, what's up, man? Everybody's looking for you. What are you doing out here? I mean, we can read between the lines and we can probably hear them saying, where have you been? We got work to do. We're popular now. You see all those people that came last time? Do you see what you did for them? You're tearing down boundaries. You're lifting up the poor. It's time for revolution, right? They're excited. And I love Jesus' response. He says, well, let us go somewhere else, actually. We're going to move on to nearby villages so I can preach there also. He says, that is why I have come. And the text tells us that he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and driving out demons. Throughout this ministry of transformation and setback and conflict and threats and overwhelming pressure, he stayed engaged, right? He showed incredible fortitude and grit. He didn't back down. Yet he also consistently withdrew to the homes of friends, to the lake, to the wilderness, to the mountains, to be filled back up. And you see this pattern all throughout the Gospel of Mark. Jesus engages with the world around him, often resulting in conflict, and he withdraws to safer spaces of quiet rest and renewal. You see that engagement and withdrawal. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you just a few questions that I want you to reflect on. This is your time to allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you. Right? I was talking to Tanya and Dustin and Christina this week. We're talking about preaching and all sorts of things. And one thing Tanya was pointing out is that what we have to do after sermons and after we hear these things or study the Bible is we need to allow the Holy Spirit to speak to us, to lead us in what direction we need to go personally, and to make that distance and say, how do we apply this to my life? So let me ask you a few questions for you to think about and allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you. Engagement. How engaged are you with the world around you? How engaged are you with the world around you? To what degree have you disengaged, checked out, and abandoned the things you know you ought to be doing? Too often we know what we ought to be doing, but we have checked out and disengaged. This pandemic and the struggles that we're facing has caused probably a lot of us, me included, to just pull away totally sometimes, which that's not what we're called to totally check out of everything. No, Jesus still has a mission for us. So to what degree have you disengaged? And maybe the opposite is true to you. To what degree are you overly engaged, doing too much? Or maybe you're just engaged in the wrong things and you're busy with all this stuff that's not really what God has called you to do. So think about your engagement with the world around you. Are you engaged? Are you present to your family and your friends and the people around you? Are you listening to the struggles of the people? Are you staying informed? Are you engaged? And I'll put these in the comments in just a moment so you can reflect on these later. You can go back and screenshot this. But engagement, think about these questions this week. And then withdrawal. Are you intentionally taking time to withdraw and pull away to spend meaningful time with God, with trusted family and friends, and yourself? We got to distinguish between the zoning out, because that's not what withdrawing means for this purpose of what Jesus was doing. It's okay to zone out sometimes, but we're talking about an intentionality of meaningful time with God, with trusted family and friends, and yourself. And maybe you can think about what is one way you can practice meaningful and life-giving withdrawal this week. Maybe even today, so you don't forget. What is one thing you can do? What restores you and what brings you life? Engagement and withdrawal.